In 1979, a beloved small-town pastor vanished without a trace, leaving his family and congregation shattered 20 years later. A renovation crew pries open the church floor and uncovers a hidden Bible, a rusted key, and a blood-stained cloth, reigniting the mystery of what really happened the night he disappeared. The first swing of the sledgehammer cracked through the warped boards, sending up a puff of dust that shimmered in the late morning sun, slanting through the stained glass. The church had stood empty for years, its once polished pews coated in grime, the hymnals brittle with age. Now in 1999, a renovation crew worked to bring life back into the building, their laughter and chatter echoing in a space that had long been silent. But beneath the boards near the pulpit, the hammer struck something that did not sound like wood. The workers crouched low, prying up splintered planks until a dark cavity revealed itself. The air that rushed out carried the smell of soil long undisturbed, tinged with something faintly metallic. One of the men shone a flashlight into the void, and the beam caught on leather, cracked and curling with age. They eased the object out a Bible, its cover stiff and worn, the gilded letters dulled by time. Beneath it lay a length of white cloth stained deep with the brown trace of old blood, and beside that a rusted iron key with teeth jagged as if hand-filed. The room grew quiet as the objects were placed on the bare wood, the weight of discovery settling over them. This church was not just a place of worship, it was a place where something had been hidden, something that carried the ghost of the past. Someone murmured the name everyone in town still remembered, Pastor Thomas Reed. In 1979, he had delivered his last sermon on a humid July evening, his voice calm but charged with urgency. That night, he walked out of the church and was never seen again. His disappearance had divided the town. Some claimed he had run off. Others swore darker forces were at work. His family had been left with only questions, the church closing its doors soon after. Now, 2 decades later, the silence was broken not by hymns, but by the scrape of crowbars and the uneasy breaths of men who knew they had uncovered something meant to stay buried. The Bible with its handwritten notes, the blood-stained cloth, and the key spoke of secrets concealed in the floorboards of a house of God. And for the first time in 20 years, the story of Pastor Reed was no longer resting quietly in memory. It was stirring again, ready to demand answers. Word of the discovery spread quickly through the town, traveling from the renovation crew to the sheriff's office, and by nightfall it had reached the ears of those who had lived with the unanswered question for 2 decades. Daniel Reed sat in his small apartment on the outskirts of Nashville when the call came. A voice he hadn't heard since boyhood, that of Samuel Harlan, one of his father's old deacons, told him the church was being repaired and something had been found beneath the floor. Samuel's tone was uneven, carrying both wonder and dread. Daniel listened in silence, his knuckles whitening around the phone as Samuel described the Bible, the key, the cloth. For Daniel, the memories stirred like dust from a long-locked room. He was only 12 when his father vanished, and the years that followed had been marked by whispers he could never escape. Some children at school mocked him, claiming his father had abandoned them. Others repeated their parents' suspicions that something shameful had forced the pastor to disappear. His mother had died young, worn down by grief and suspicion, leaving Daniel with a legacy of bitterness and unanswered questions. Now, after 20 years of silence, he was being told that pieces of the past had emerged from under the very floor his father once preached above. He packed a bag without hesitation, the weight of unfinished grief pressing him toward the town he had sworn never to return to. When he arrived the next afternoon, the church looked smaller than he remembered, its steeple no longer reaching as high as it had in childhood. The windows were cracked, the once proud white siding dulled to gray. He stepped inside cautiously, inhaling the mix of dust, wood, and faint paint, thinner from the crew's supplies. Near the pulpit, taped off in yellow, lay the evidence on a table. The Bible, its cover cracked, rested open to reveal marginal notes in his father's steady hand. The iron key glinted faintly in the afternoon light, and the stained cloth sat folded, its silence more terrible than words. Daniel stood over them for a long moment, his throat tight. Whatever had happened in 1979 had not been erased by time. The truth, buried and locked away, had waited beneath the church floor. And now it was reaching for him. Daniel traced his fingers over the brittle leather cover of the Bible, almost afraid that touching it too firmly might cause it to crumble. The marginal notes were written in his father's hand, the familiar cursive he had not seen since boyhood. They were not passages of scripture, but fragments of thought, half-finished sentences, cryptic warnings. One line, written in the margin of Psalms, read, "They sit among us clothed as shepherds, but their teeth are those of wolves." Another scribble in the back pages said simply, "If anything happens, it will begin here." He felt his chest tighten as he leaned closer, the words blurring through the film of tears he refused to shed in front of the deputy standing guard nearby. Sheriff Colton had not yet arrived, but the deputy explained that the items would be sent for testing. Daniel nodded numbly, though the thought of the Bible and cloth being boxed and shipped off left him unsettled. These were not just pieces of evidence. They were the last tangible things left of his father. Outside, the autumn light was fading, painting the steeple in shades of orange and gold. Samuel Harlan arrived, moving slowly with the aid of a cane, but his eyes still held a sharpness Daniel remembered well. The old deacon looked at the evidence table, then at Daniel, and his lips pressed into a thin line. "Your father tried to tell me things," Samuel said quietly, "things I didn't want to hear. I thought it was just his burden as pastor, but maybe I should have listened closer." Daniel asked what he meant, but Samuel shook his head. "Not yet. Too much was buried back then, not just under these floors. You'll see soon enough." The words lingered as the crew packed up for the night, leaving Daniel alone in the sanctuary. The stained glass was fractured, but as the last light of day passed through it, shards of color painted the cracked floor. He closed his eyes and tried to summon the memory of his father's voice delivering sermons from that pulpit. Instead, all he could hear was silence, weighted by secrets. The Bible, the key, and the cloth had surfaced for a reason, and Daniel knew this was only the beginning of uncovering what had really happened in 1979. Sheriff Colton arrived the following morning, his broad frame filling the doorway of the sanctuary as if he were carrying the weight of every year since the case had first crossed his desk. His hair had gone white, his face creased deeply, but his eyes flickered with something Daniel could not mistake: unease. The sheriff greeted him curtly, avoiding his gaze as he walked to the table where the evidence still lay. Colton studied the Bible for a long time without touching it. "I remember your father carried this everywhere," he said finally, his voice low. "Strange to see it come back now." His glance shifted to the stained cloth, and Daniel saw his jaw tighten before he turned away. Daniel pressed him, asking why the case had been left to gather dust for 2 decades. Colton exhaled heavily and leaned against the pulpit. "Back then we didn't have much to go on. He vanished overnight. No body, no ransom note, no witnesses who'd speak, just rumors, and plenty of those. Some folks claimed he ran off, others whispered he crossed the wrong people, and the answer did not satisfy him. Daniel reminded the sheriff that he had been a deputy in 1979, close enough to see how the investigation was handled. Colton's silence was telling. After a long pause, he said, "The church board wanted it put to rest. They pushed hard to call it voluntary. I was young, still trying to keep my badge. I didn't fight it." The admission hung in the air like a confession. Daniel's anger rose, but beneath it was a deeper sorrow. His father had been erased, not only by whoever silenced him, but also by those who should have pursued justice. Colton placed a hand on the pulpit, his weathered fingers brushing the wood. "If you're going to dig this up, you need to be ready for what you'll find. There are things people in this town would rather keep buried." Daniel met his gaze steadily. "I've lived my whole life in the shadow of not knowing. Whatever's been buried, I'll face it." The sheriff gave a slow nod, though the shadow in his eyes deepened. The truth was stirring again, and Colton seemed to know it was not going to stay gentle. That evening, Daniel walked the church grounds alone, his footsteps crunching over the gravel path that circled the sanctuary. The building loomed in the dimming light, its steeple jagged against the fading sky. He stopped near the side entrance where he remembered standing as a boy, waiting for his father to finish evening prayers. The door was warped now, its paint peeled away, but as he ran his hand across the rough wood, he felt a strange familiarity, as if the place itself still carried his father's presence. Inside, the workers had left their tools scattered, the air thick with the smell of sawdust. Daniel moved to the pulpit where the boards had been pulled up. He crouched and shone a flashlight into the hollow. The compartment beneath was larger than he had expected, stretching under a wide portion of the floor. His beam caught scratches on the wood, grooves that looked deliberate, as though someone had pried it open before. He felt a chill, realizing the hiding place might have been used more than once, not just on the night the Bible, key, and cloth were placed there. He lowered himself onto the first pew and sat in silence, listening to the creaks of the old building. Memories flickered his father's voice rising in sermon, the congregation murmuring hymns, the warmth of Sunday mornings when the church was alive. But layered over those memories was the heavy absence that had followed, the years of unanswered questions and the shame of whispered speculation. As he sat, Samuel Harlan entered quietly, leaning on his cane. He lowered himself beside Daniel and spoke in a voice scarcely above a whisper. "Your father wasn't a man who frightened easy, but the weeks before he vanished, he carried himself different, restless, watchful. He told me he'd uncovered something, that it was eating at the heart of this place. I asked him to share it, but he said he needed proof first." Daniel turned to him sharply, but Samuel shook his head. "I never pressed harder. I regret that every day. If I had, maybe—" His words trailed off into silence. Daniel looked back at the hollow under the pulpit. Proof, his father had said. And whatever it was, it had been dangerous enough to end his life and lie hidden beneath the church for 20 years. The next morning, Daniel visited the parsonage that once belonged to his family, a small white house set just behind the church. Time had not been kind to it. The shutters hung crooked, and ivy climbed unchecked up the clapboard walls. He remembered it as warm and bustling, filled with his mother's cooking and his father's laughter, but now it stood hollow, a shell of what it had been. The renovation crew had left it untouched, and the air inside was musty, heavy with mildew and silence. Daniel wandered through the room slowly, pausing at the study where his father had written his sermons. Dust lay thick on the shelves, though a few books still leaned together as if left in a hurry. He pulled one free and saw a thin envelope tucked between the pages. Inside was a folded scrap of paper, yellowed and brittle. The writing was hurried, almost desperate. "They will not stop. If the truth comes out, they will destroy everything. Keep Daniel safe." The words gripped him like a hand around his chest. He read them again, his pulse quickening. His father had known he was in danger, had left behind a plea meant for his family. The note was unsigned, but Daniel recognized the handwriting instantly. He carried it outside into the morning light, trying to steady his breathing. Samuel, waiting near the porch, read the fear on his face before Daniel even spoke. When Daniel handed him the note, the old deacon closed his eyes as though he had expected something like this to surface. "He tried to protect you," Samuel said softly. "Whatever he uncovered, he knew it wasn't safe for a boy to be anywhere near it." Daniel asked if his father had ever spoken of who they were, but Samuel only shook his head. Names were never spoken, just shadows, men who smiled in the pews but made their deals in the dark. Daniel looked back toward the church steeple rising above the trees. The Bible, the cloth, the key, and now this note, they were threads of a tapestry that had been hidden for 2 decades. Each clue deepened the mystery, but together they whispered the same truth. His father had not abandoned them, he had been silenced, and the silence had been carefully maintained by people still alive and perhaps still watching. Daniel spent that afternoon walking the length of Main Street, where the heart of the town still pulsed in diners, hardware stores, and narrow storefronts that seemed frozen in another decade. People recognized him, some offering polite nods, others staring a beat too long before whispering to their companions. His return was not just a son coming home, it was the reopening of an old wound the town had tried to heal with silence. At the corner cafe, a group of older men sat at a window booth, their voices low until Daniel stepped inside. The conversation faltered. He ordered coffee and took a seat near the back, his gaze drifting toward them. One of the men, a former church elder named Wallace, finally approached. His steps were slow, his expression unreadable. "You look just like him," Wallace said, his voice carrying both admiration and unease. Thomas was a good man, but he was stubborn, sometimes too stubborn for his own good. Daniel asked what he meant. Wallace's eyes darted toward the other men at the booth before he leaned in. "Your father wanted to stand against people he shouldn't have. There were business dealings tied to the church, money changing hands. He thought exposing it would cleanse the congregation. But not everyone wanted the light." The words stung, both as warning and confession. Daniel pressed for details, but Wallace shook his head. "I've already said more than I should. Some truths don't just stir the past, they rattle the present." With that, he returned to his booth, leaving Daniel with more questions than answers. When he left the cafe, the air outside felt heavier. He could feel the eyes of the town following him, not with welcome, but with caution, as though his search threatened to dredge up something they had long agreed to leave buried. He walked back toward the church with a growing sense that his father's disappearance had not been an isolated act of violence or tragedy. It was entwined with the very fabric of the town, with people still sitting in their familiar places, still guarding secrets that had cost his father his life. The silence around him was no longer ignorance, it was protection, and Daniel knew breaking it would not come without consequence. That night, Daniel sat alone in his motel room, the note from the parsonage spread on the small table beside the cracked Bible. The words seemed to echo in the silence. "They will not stop. Keep Daniel safe." He could not escape the thought that his father had been carrying a burden no one else dared shoulder, a truth so dangerous that it had consumed him. The town's evasions and half-spoken warnings only deepened the weight of that realization. Sleep eluded him, so just after midnight he drove back to the church. The building loomed against the dark sky, its steeple a crooked silhouette. Inside, the air was thick and cool, holding the quiet like a secret. He walked to the pulpit and crouched again by the hollow where the compartment had been found. His flashlight traced the beams of wood and patches of dirt beneath. That was when he noticed something he had missed before: an old nail hammered into the side beam with a scrap of fabric caught beneath it. With some effort, he freed it and brought it into the light. It was only a small fragment, barely larger than his palm, but the material matched the robe his father had often worn while preaching. The edges were stiff, the faintest discoloration suggesting it had been soaked in something long ago. Daniel's chest tightened. His father had been beneath this floor, or at least what remained of him had been here once. As he stood in the dark sanctuary clutching the scrap, the weight of the silence pressed harder. It was not the silence of a forgotten building, but of something guarded, something that had been kept hidden at the cost of truth. He thought of Sheriff Colton's evasive answers, Samuel's whispered warnings, Wallace's reluctant confession. Threads were beginning to weave together, forming the shape of a conspiracy larger than his father alone. Daniel placed the fabric carefully beside the Bible and the note, the pieces of a puzzle that seemed to grow with each discovery. He looked up at the pulpit where his father once stood, his voice filling this very space, and he whispered into the still air, "I'll finish what you started." The empty church gave no reply, but in that moment, Daniel knew he had crossed a line. The search was no longer about curiosity or closure. It was about justice. And justice, he realized, would not come quietly. The following morning, Daniel carried the scrap of fabric to the sheriff's office, his jaw set with determination. Sheriff Colton received him in a cramped room lined with dusty filing cabinets and faded photographs of past deputies. The sheriff listened without interruption as Daniel explained where he had found it, his flashlight beam catching on the fragment beneath the pulpit. When Daniel placed the cloth on the desk, Colton's face hardened, his eyes fixed on it as if it were a ghost laid out before him. "That shouldn't be there," Colton said finally, his voice rough. "When we searched this church in '79, there was nothing. Not a trace." He leaned back, the leather chair creaking. If that was pinned under a beam all this time, somebody made sure it was out of sight. Daniel pressed him again, demanding to know why the original investigation had been ended so quickly. Colton's gaze dropped to his hands. "I told you, the board wanted it closed. They said a missing pastor would damage the congregation, ruin the town's standing. They leaned hard on us, harder than you'd believe." His voice dropped. "But I remember that night. There was a smear of blood near the pulpit. Not much, just enough to make me wonder. By the next morning it was gone, wiped clean before anyone else could see." The revelation sent a chill through Daniel. His father had bled in that sanctuary, and someone had erased the evidence. He asked why Colton had stayed silent all these years. The sheriff's jaw worked as though chewing over words too bitter to speak. "Because I was young and afraid of losing my badge, afraid of what would happen to my family if I pushed too far. And maybe because I already knew the men on that board were capable of more than sermons and handshakes." Daniel left the office with his anger simmering. The town had chosen its reputation over his father's life, and the sheriff himself had carried the guilt of it for 2 decades. Standing on the steps outside, Daniel looked back toward the steeple in the distance. Each clue pulled him deeper, each confession added to the weight of the silence that had smothered the truth. His father had not simply vanished. He had been taken, and the town had let it happen. Daniel left the sheriff's office carrying the weight of Colton's reluctant confession like a stone lodged in his chest. The afternoon sun had dipped low, casting long shadows over the courthouse square. He walked without direction, his mind replaying the words, "blood wiped away, evidence erased, the board pressing to bury the case." Each detail cut deeper, transforming his father's disappearance from a mystery into something that felt deliberate, orchestrated. He found himself outside the public library, its tall windows glowing softly in the fading light. On impulse, he stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of paper and polish, unchanged since his childhood visits with his father. He asked the librarian for old church bulletins and local newspapers from 1979, and after a hesitant pause, she guided him to the archives. The reels of microfilm whirred as Daniel scrolled through brittle pages, each headline a snapshot of the past. At first, the articles were filled with sermons, charity drives, and glowing words about Pastor Reed's leadership. But in the months leading up to July, the tone shifted. Mentions of the church's finances grew more pointed fundraisers, with unclear purposes, donations unaccounted for, rumors of a large building expansion that never materialized. His father's name was absent from those later pieces, as though his voice had been silenced even before his disappearance. One bulletin in particular caught Daniel's attention. Dated only weeks before his father vanished, it contained a short, cryptic announcement. "The congregation is reminded of discretion in matters of stewardship and trust." The phrasing was cold, unlike the warm invitations his father used to pen. Daniel printed the page, staring at the words as unease coiled in his stomach. As he gathered his things, an older woman approached. Her hair was silver, her eyes sharp. "You're Thomas Reed's boy," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "I saw you come in. Your father was a brave man, braver than most, but bravery has its price." Daniel asked what she meant, but she only touched his arm gently before turning away. "Some things weren't meant to stay hidden forever. Be careful where you step." RT. Daniel left the library with the bulletin in hand, his pulse quickening. Each clue seemed to tighten the circle, drawing him towards something larger than a single man's disappearance. Whatever his father had uncovered, it had shaken the foundations of both the church and the town, and those foundations were beginning to crack again. Daniel woke before dawn, the motel room cloaked in silence, save for the hum of the old air conditioner. He sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the bulletin he had copied, its formal language still gnawing at him. Discretion in matters of stewardship and trust. It was not a call for generosity, but a warning to keep mouths shut. His father's marginal notes in the Bible returned to him, wolves among the flock. The words now seemed to echo the same truth. By mid-morning, he returned to the church, where the renovation crew had resumed work. Sawdust hung in the air, catching the light streaming through the fractured stained glass. Daniel lingered near the pulpit, watching the workers as they tore away more of the rotten flooring. One of them, a young man with sleeves rolled to his elbows, called out that he had found something wedged between two beams. Daniel hurried over as they pried loose a thin wooden box, its edges warped with damp. Inside were scraps of burned paper, the ashes fused together into brittle clumps. The fragments that remained legible were enough to send a shiver through him. They appeared to be church ledgers, but the numbers were altered, lines scratched out, columns rewritten in hurried hands. He took one of the fragments carefully, reading what he could. There were mentions of outside contributions and private allocations, with sums that far exceeded anything a small-town congregation could raise. Daniel realized his father must have discovered these records and recognized them for what they were: evidence of corruption tied to powerful men. As the crew carried the box to the sheriff's office, Daniel lingered in the sanctuary. He imagined his father standing at that very pulpit, torn between protecting his family and speaking the truth. He wondered if the note found in the parsonage, the plea to keep Daniel safe, had been written after holding these same ledgers in his hands. The church creaked around him, the weight of the years pressing down. Each discovery brought clarity, but also danger. The deeper he dug, the more he could feel unseen eyes turning his way, as though the very act of stirring up the past was pulling long-buried secrets back into the light. Daniel followed the sheriff into the back office as the box of charred ledgers was set on the desk. The fragments looked fragile, but even in their ruined state they carried the shape of something damning. Colton poked at the edges with a pencil, his mouth tightening as he read the surviving lines. "These numbers don't make sense for a congregation this size," he muttered. "Someone was moving money through here, a lot of it." Daniel asked the question that had haunted him since childhood: had his father uncovered this before he vanished? Colton didn't answer right away. He leaned back in his chair, the old leather groaning under his weight, and rubbed his temples. "Your father came to me once, a few weeks before he disappeared. He said he had found something that put him in danger. He wanted me to keep an eye on things. But he didn't show me the proof, just said he needed more time." Colton's eyes lifted, tired and heavy. "When he went missing, I knew in my gut it was connected. But without a body, without evidence, I had nothing but suspicion, and suspicion wasn't enough to stand against the men who ran this town." The admission felt like a blade twisting in Daniel's chest. His father had trusted Colton, and Colton had stayed silent. For 2 decades, the truth had been buried, not only under the church floor, but under the weight of fear and complicity. Daniel left the office with the fragments tucked in a folder. The town square was quiet as he walked across it, yet he felt exposed, as if the walls themselves had eyes. He remembered Wallace's warning in the cafe and Samuel's guarded words. They all spoke of wolves, of shadows, of dangers that outlived the man who had tried to challenge them. At the church that evening, Daniel sat in the first pew staring at the pulpit, the broken floor yawning beneath it. He thought of his father's last sermon, the way he had spoken of truth as a light that could not be extinguished. Yet the light had been smothered, leaving Daniel to stumble through the darkness years later. Now the evidence was surfacing piece by piece, and with it came a question he could not shake. If his father's warnings had cost him his life, what would digging deeper cost him? That night, Daniel drove aimlessly through the town's quiet streets, the glow of old street lamps stretching across cracked pavement. He passed storefronts that had barely changed since 1979, the same pharmacy sign buzzing faintly, the same hardware store window filled with tools behind dusty glass. The familiarity should have comforted him, but instead it unsettled him. It was as if the town itself had stood still while the truth was left to rot beneath its church. He parked near the edge of town where a diner's neon sign flickered. Inside, the air was heavy with grease and coffee, and only a handful of patrons lingered in booths. Daniel slid into a corner seat, ordering nothing but black coffee. He pulled out the fragment of his father's note and read it again, tracing the words with his thumb. The phrase, "They will not stop," echoed in his head. An elderly woman at the counter turned to glance at him. Her eyes lingered, narrowing slightly as recognition passed over her face. She left her stool and approached, moving slowly with a cane. "You're Thomas Reed's boy," she said softly. Daniel nodded, wary. She lowered herself into the booth opposite him without waiting for an invitation. "I saw something that night. Been carrying it for 20 years. Her voice trembled but carried a steady conviction. "I lived across from the church back then. Couldn't sleep that night, so I sat by the window. Around midnight, I saw 2 men carrying something heavy out the side door. Looked like they struggled with it. They loaded it into a truck and drove off without lights." Daniel leaned forward, his pulse quickening. He asked if she recognized the men. She hesitated, her knuckles tightening around the cane. "One of them was Deacon Martin. I'd know his walk anywhere. The other, I couldn't be sure." He kept his face low. Her eyes met his, sharp despite her age. "I wanted to tell someone, but I was afraid of what might happen to me if I spoke. Now I'm old and I can't carry it anymore." Daniel sat in silence, the din of clinking dishes fading around him. He finally had what he had long feared and long hoped for, a witness who confirmed what his heart already knew. His father hadn't walked away. He had been carried. Daniel left the diner with the woman's words echoing in his ears, the night air thick and cool as if the town itself was listening. Deacon Martin, the name carried weight, stirring old memories of a tall, stern man who had once stood at his father's side during services. Martin had been respected, a man of presence in the community, but Daniel remembered the unease he felt even as a boy when the deacon's gaze lingered too long, sharp and appraising. Back at the motel, Daniel pulled out the folder of notes and clippings, adding the woman's testimony to the growing puzzle. His father had uncovered corruption within the church. He had left behind warnings, written in the margins of Scripture. Blood had been wiped from the sanctuary floor. Now there was confirmation that his body had been carried out of the church that night, not vanished into thin air. And one of the men responsible still lived somewhere beyond the shadows of memory. Sleep refused to come. At dawn, Daniel drove out of town toward the countryside, guided by little more than instinct. The road narrowed between rows of pines until he reached a weathered farmhouse where Samuel Harlan lived. The old deacon answered the door with weary eyes and led him inside, offering coffee as if he had expected the visit. Daniel wasted no time. He asked about Deacon Martin, about the whispers of money that flowed through the church. Samuel's hands shook as he set the cups down. "Your father trusted me," he said quietly. "But he never trusted Martin. Said he kept 2 faces, one for the congregation and one for those he did business with after dark. I warned him not to go poking where he wasn't wanted." Samuel's gaze fell heavy with regret. The night Thomas disappeared, Martin left town within weeks, sold his property cheap, said he had family up north. No one saw him again. Daniel pressed for more, but Samuel's voice dropped to a whisper. "Your father wasn't just killed. He was silenced because he found proof they couldn't risk him speaking, and Martin was at the center of it." The words confirmed what Daniel already felt in his bones. His father's death was not an accident or a mystery. It was a crime rooted in greed and betrayal, and the trail now led straight to a man who had once stood as a guardian of the church. Daniel drove back into town with Samuel's words etched into his mind, each mile on the cracked road heavy with the knowledge that Deacon Martin had not only betrayed his father, but had walked away untouched. The morning sun lit the steeple of the church in pale gold as he parked near the square. Though its beauty felt hollow now, the building's shadow stretched across streets that had harbored silence for 2 decades. Inside the sheriff's office, Daniel laid out what he had been told. Colton listened with his arms folded, his expression hardening as the name Deacon Martin was spoken. For a long moment he said nothing, just tapped his finger against the desk. Finally he muttered, "Martin was always slippery. Left right when things got hot. There were rumors he had debts tied to men outside town, people who wouldn't hesitate to bury anyone who crossed them. Your father must have stood in their way. Daniel demanded to know why Martin had never been pursued, why no warrant had been issued when his sudden departure matched the night of the disappearance. Colton looked away, his jaw tightening. Because the board leaned on us, because people with money kept us in check, and because we didn't have a body. Without that, we had nothing solid to pin on him. His voice dropped lower, tinged with something close to shame. But I should have done more. The bitterness in Daniel's chest flared. His father had been left unavenged because men feared rocking the foundation of the town. Evidence had been erased, testimony silenced, and the one person bold enough to challenge corruption had paid with his life. Colton finally slid open a drawer and retrieved an old folder. Inside were faded photographs, handwritten reports, and the missing persons notice from 1979. He pushed it toward Daniel. This is all that's left of the official file. Take it. Maybe you can see what I couldn't. Daniel picked up the folder, his hands trembling as he glanced at the grainy photographs of his father's last sermon, his warm face frozen in time. He closed the file with care and looked at the sheriff. I'm not letting it end in silence again. For the first time, Colton didn't argue. He only nodded, as though he too knew the reckoning was coming and that the years of silence had finally run out. That evening, Daniel spread the sheriff's old file across the motel bed, the pages brittle and yellowed, the ink faded but still legible. He read every line carefully, searching for what might have been overlooked. Most of the reports were shallow, a thin collection of statements from church members who all said the same thing, that Pastor Reed had been last seen leaving the sanctuary alone, his face solemn, his destination unknown. There was no mention of blood found near the pulpit, no reference to the whispers about missing funds, no suggestion of the board's influence. The official story was one of disappearance, not suspicion. Near the bottom of the file, he found a photograph he had never seen before. It showed the church steps taken days after his father vanished. At first, it seemed unremarkable, just townspeople gathered, their faces blurred with age and grain. But when Daniel leaned closer, he saw a figure at the edge of the frame, half turned, as if caught mid-step. The man's posture, tall and stiff, matched what he remembered of Deacon Martin. Daniel held the photograph up to the lamplight, his pulse quickening. It was not proof, but it was presence. Martin had been there when the search began, and weeks later he was gone, his property sold, his name erased from town records. It was a vanishing almost as sudden as his father's, but without the weight of grief to follow it. He set the photograph aside and flipped back through the notes. A pattern began to form. Names of donors connected to businesses outside town, sudden withdrawals marked as expansion, and then silence after July of 1979. It was as though the books had been scrubbed clean, but only after his father's disappearance. The motel walls seemed to close in as Daniel considered what it meant. His father had been silenced not just for questioning morality, but for uncovering financial ties that linked the church to men who profited from its trust. Deacon Martin had played a role, but he had not acted alone. Daniel closed the folder and stared at the ceiling, the hum of the air conditioner filling the silence. For the first time in 20 years, the trail was not cold. It was alive, and it was pulling him toward the heart of a truth others had died to bury. The next day, Daniel drove out to the edge of town where the Reed family plot lay beneath a cluster of oaks. The cemetery was quiet, the ground soft with fallen leaves. His mother's stone stood at the end of the row, simple and weathered, the engraving nearly faded by time. Beside it was a bare patch of grass where a stone for his father had never been placed. His mother had refused, always clinging to the hope that Thomas might walk through the door again. Now, standing over that emptiness, Daniel felt the weight of her choice. The absence of a marker was a wound still open. He knelt, the autumn air sharp in his lungs, and rested the photograph of Deacon Martin at the edge of the grass. "I think I finally know what happened to you," he whispered. "You didn't leave us. You were taken." His voice broke as he thought of his father's last sermon, words of courage that had been paid for in silence. A rustle behind him drew Daniel's attention. An older man stood at the gate, leaning heavily on a cane. It was Wallace from the cafe, his eyes cautious but searching. He walked slowly across the graves until he stood a few feet away. "I shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low, "but I saw you digging, not with a shovel, but with questions. You're stirring things that folks here don't want stirred." Daniel rose, anger simmering beneath his grief. "My father was murdered, and everyone seems content to call it a mystery." Wallace's gaze dropped to the ground. It wasn't just Martin, there were others. Businessmen, landowners. They used the church to launder money, to cover debts. Your father found out. He told Martin he would expose it during his next sermon. Wallace paused, his breath ragged. That sermon never happened. The confession hung heavy in the air. Daniel pressed him for names, but Wallace shook his head, fear plain in his eyes. "Some of them are still alive, still powerful. You need to understand what you're walking into." Daniel looked back at the empty patch of earth beside his mother's grave. "I don't care how powerful they are. My father deserves the truth." Wallace's face was pale, his hand tightening on the cane. "Then God help you, son, because they won't." Daniel left the cemetery, with Wallace's warning circling his mind like a storm. The afternoon sky had darkened, clouds heavy with the promise of rain, and the streets of the town seemed quieter than usual, as if the place itself was holding its breath. He drove back to the church, unable to shake the feeling that every answer led only to deeper shadows. Inside, the renovation crew had paused their work. Piles of lumber leaned against the wall, and the sanctuary floor was a patchwork of new boards laid beside gaping holes. Daniel wandered toward the pulpit, his eyes drawn again to the hollow space beneath it. He crouched down and studied the beams where he had found the scrap of his father's robe. Running his hand along the wood, his fingers caught on something metallic, wedged into a corner. With effort, he pulled it free. It was a small tape recorder, rusted at the edges but still intact. The cassette inside was labeled with his father's handwriting, the ink faded but legible. July 14, 1979. Daniel's pulse quickened. This was the night his father had vanished. He rushed it to Samuel's farmhouse, knowing the old deacon kept a working player. Together they sat in the dim kitchen, the only sound the steady tick of a clock on the wall. Samuel pressed play, and after a hiss of static, his father's voice filled the room. The words were strained, urgent. "If you are hearing this, it means my fears were right. The men I trusted have betrayed their vows. Money has been taken, laundered through the church. I have records. I cannot stay silent." His voice wavered, then strengthened. "They warned me to stop. Tonight I will confront them. If I do not return, know that the truth must be carried forward. Protect Daniel." The tape ended in static, leaving the kitchen heavy with silence. Samuel bowed his head, his hands trembling. He knew they were coming for him, he whispered, and he faced them anyway. Daniel sat frozen, the sound of his father's voice ringing in his ears after 20 years of silence. The recording was more than evidence. It was a final sermon, a dying declaration. And it left no doubt his father had been silenced because he chose the truth. Daniel drove back to town with the tape recorder resting on the passenger seat, the sound of his father's voice still alive in his mind. The storm had broken overhead, rain drumming against the windshield, the wipers barely keeping pace. Each sweep of water across the glass felt like time itself washing away excuses, erasing the lies that had buried the truth for so long. At the sheriff's office, Colton listened to the tape in silence. When the final static hiss faded, he sat motionless, his expression heavy. "This changes everything," he said finally. "A statement like this is as close to testimony as we're going to get from a dead man. It proves intent, proves he knew who threatened him." Daniel leaned forward, his voice low and sharp. "Then why are we not hauling people in right now? Why are men who destroyed my father still walking free?" Colton's eyes shifted toward the rain-lashed window. "Because most of the men he named without naming are ghosts now. Dead, moved on, buried just like your father was meant to be. But Martin could still be alive. If he is, he's the thread we pull." The name hung between them, heavy as thunder. Daniel remembered the photograph, the woman's testimony, the whispers of debts and deals. Each clue pointed to the deacon who had walked away while the town closed its eyes. Colton pulled a worn map from his desk, circling an address in a county 2 hours north. "I've heard his name come up a few times in old reports. Nothing solid, but there's a property listed under a relative of his. A farmhouse, remote. If he's anywhere, that's where he'll be." Daniel stared at the circle, his hands clenched into fists. For 20 years he had lived with silence. Now he had a location, a direction, the possibility of a face to hold accountable. The storm outside cracked with lightning, briefly flooding the room with light. Colton folded the map and slid it across the desk. "You need to be ready. Men like Martin don't confess easily, and if he's lived with this secret for 20 years, he won't let it go without a fight." Daniel slipped the map into his jacket, his jaw set. "Then I'll fight harder. For him." His father's words on the tape had been clear: "Carry the truth forward." And Daniel knew there would be no turning back now. The rain had slowed to a mist by the time Daniel left the sheriff's office, the map folded tightly in his hand. He sat in his car for a long moment, listening to the steady tap of droplets against the roof, his father's voice from the tape replaying again and again in his mind. The message was clear: his father had chosen truth over fear, and it had cost him his life. Now that truth had passed to Daniel, and it felt heavier than anything he had ever carried. He drove aimlessly through town, the streets nearly deserted, the shop windows glowing faintly against the wet pavement. Every corner held memories of his childhood, of walking beside his father on Sunday afternoons, of his mother's quiet strength when questions went unanswered. Those memories, once dulled by time, now burned with urgency. The past was no longer buried, it was clawing its way to the surface. Daniel stopped near the edge of the square where the church rose dark against the mist. He stepped out, the air damp and cool, and walked up the path. Inside, the sanctuary was empty, the renovation crew gone for the night, leaving behind their tools and piles of lumber. He stood at the pulpit, the very spot where his father had once delivered sermons, where his final words to the congregation might have been meant to expose the men who betrayed him. The hollow beneath the floorboards yawned open, a reminder of how easily the truth had been hidden. Daniel knelt, running his hand along the new beams the crew had laid. "I'll finish this," he whispered into the silence, his voice trembling. "I won't let them bury you again." As he rose, he noticed movement at the back of the church. A figure lingered in the shadows near the doorway, watching. Daniel's breath caught as the man stepped forward, the dim light revealing the lined face of Samuel Harlan. The old deacon's eyes were troubled, his cane tapping lightly against the wood as he approached. "You've stirred something that won't rest easy," Samuel said quietly. "Martin won't let go of his secrets, not after all these years. If you go to him, you'd best be ready for what you'll hear. It won't just change what you know about your father, it'll change what you know about this town." Daniel nodded, his resolve steady. Whatever waited at that farmhouse, it was the path his father's voice had set before him, and he was prepared to walk it. Daniel left the church with Samuel's warning pressing against his thoughts like a weight he could not shake. The drive north wound through stretches of farmland and pine, the mist thinning into streaks of moonlight that lit the wet road ahead. Every mile carried him further from the town he had grown up in, yet closer to the heart of the truth that had haunted him for 20 years. The farmhouse came into view just after midnight, its silhouette crouched against the tree line, the roof sagging in places, the windows dark. Daniel pulled to the side of the gravel drive and cut the engine, sitting in silence with his hands gripping the wheel. He thought of his father's voice on the tape, steady even in the face of danger, and felt a steadiness of his own settle in. He stepped out into the damp air, his footsteps crunching softly on the gravel as he approached the porch. The boards groaned under his weight, and for a moment he wondered if the house was even occupied. Then a dim light flickered on inside, spilling through a thin curtain. The door opened slowly, and an older man appeared, tall even in his frailty. His frame stooped but unmistakably familiar. The sharp eyes that had once scanned the congregation now narrowed on Daniel. "You're Reed's boy," he said, his voice gravelly with age but carrying a cold recognition. Daniel nodded, his jaw tight. "You knew him. You were there the night he disappeared." Martin leaned against the doorframe, a faint, bitter smile tugging at his lips. "I was there for more than that, and if you've come looking for answers, you'd better be ready to hear them." And the silence stretched as the two men studied one another, the weight of the past pressing between them. Daniel's heart pounded, but he did not step back. The years of unanswered questions, the silence that had scarred his family, had brought him to this moment. Martin finally stepped aside, gesturing toward the dim interior of the farmhouse. "Come in. If you want the truth about your father, you'll find it here. But I promise you, it won't set you free. It will bind you the way it bound him." Daniel crossed the threshold, knowing there was no turning back. The farmhouse smelled of dust and damp wood, the air heavy with years of neglect. Daniel followed Martin into a narrow sitting room where a single lamp cast long shadows across faded wallpaper. Stacks of yellowed newspapers and unopened mail cluttered the table, and the faint creak of the old floor echoed with every step. Martin lowered himself into a worn chair, his frame angular beneath a threadbare sweater, and studied Daniel with a sharpness that age had not dulled. "You look like him," Martin said at last, his voice low, almost thoughtful. Same eyes, same stubborn set of the jaw. He thought that truth was worth dying for. Maybe he was right. Maybe he was just a fool. Daniel forced himself to stay calm, though anger pressed at the edges of his voice. "You were with him the night he vanished. A witness saw you carry something out of the church. Was it him?" Martin's gaze did not waver. He leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "Your father found the ledgers. He knew the money wasn't clean, that it came from men who saw the church as nothing more than a laundromat for their sins. He wanted to name names from the pulpit. I warned him what would happen. He wouldn't listen." Daniel's stomach nodded. "So you silenced him?" A shadow passed across Martin's face. "I didn't put the rope around his neck, I didn't strike the final blow, but I carried the weight of him, and I carried him out that night. Because the men behind it demanded it. And because I was too much of a coward to stand beside him." His voice cracked, though his eyes stayed cold. "Your father's blood stained my hands as surely as theirs." The room seemed to close in, the ticking of a clock on the mantel loud against Daniel's heartbeat. He wanted to lunge forward, to demand every detail, but Martin raised a trembling hand. "You need to understand. The men who ordered it weren't just deacons. They were bankers, landowners, men who built this town's walls high enough to keep the truth out. Some are dead, some still sit at their tables, smiling as if they never touched the fire." Daniel's fists clenched, his voice breaking with fury. "Then give me their names." Martin's gaze burned with something between defiance and regret. "I'll give them to you, boy, but when I do, you'll wish you hadn't asked." Martin's words hung in the stale air, daring Daniel to flinch. The old deacon reached for a stack of papers, buried beneath the newspapers on the table, his hands trembling with the weight of what he was about to release. He slid a folder forward, the edges frayed, the cover smudged with fingerprints long since dried. Daniel opened it cautiously, his eyes moving over a list of names written in his father's unmistakable script. The names were familiar. Bankers who had funded the town's factories, a judge who had presided over countless cases, 2 businessmen who had donated generously to the church's building fund. And at the bottom, scrawled darker, as though pressed harder into the page, was Martin's own name. Daniel looked up sharply, fury tightening his chest. "You were part of it." Martin did not deny it. His eyes, dim but unflinching, met Daniel's. "I was. Your father wanted to tear it open, to strip away the masks we wore. He thought faith would shield him, but faith doesn't stop bullets, and it doesn't close fists." His voice dropped lower. "When the board met that night, I was the one who tried to convince them to spare him. They laughed at me. In the end, they demanded my loyalty, and I gave it." Daniel's throat burned as he forced the words out. "You carried him out of that church." Martin's hands shook where they rested on his knees. "I carried his body. I didn't kill him with my own hand, but I might as well have. He had been struck before I arrived." Blood on the pulpit, his face pale. "They made me finish what they started, made me take him out so no one would ever find him." His eyes glistened, but no tears fell. "For 20 years I've woken every night hearing his voice in my ear." The storm outside pressed against the house, wind rattling the windows as if echoing the confession. Daniel closed the folder, his father's script burning into his memory. He wanted to scream, to demand the place where his father's body had been left, but Martin spoke first, his voice a rasp. "You can take this to the sheriff, to the papers, to whoever you think will listen. But it won't bring him back, and the ones still alive, the ones with power, they'll come for you too, just like they came for him." Daniel leaned forward, his voice steady though his hands trembled. "Then let them come. This time the truth won't stay buried." Daniel left the farmhouse with the folder clutched tightly in his hands, the rain slicking his hair and soaking his jacket as he crossed the gravel drive. The storm had broken again, lightning slicing through the night sky as though nature itself bore witness to what he now carried. His father's words, preserved in ink and tape, were no longer just fragments of suspicion. They were proof, names carved into the record of betrayal. He drove back toward town with the wipers beating furiously, his mind reeling with Martin's confession. Every name on the list was a man who had once been trusted, men who had stood in pews and offered prayers while using the church as their cloak. Some were dead now, but others still lived. Their influence threaded through the town like roots too deep to pull free. Martin had given him a weapon, but also a warning. If Daniel pressed forward, he would be walking into the same fire that had consumed his father. At the motel, he spread the folder across the bed, laying the list beside the charred ledgers, the blood-stained cloth, and the note his father had left behind. Together they formed a grim mosaic, a story of faith twisted by greed and silenced by violence. Daniel stared at the pieces, the weight of them pressing against his chest until he could hardly breathe. For 2 decades he had lived under the shadow of absence, but now he held the truth in his hands. A knock startled him. Sheriff Colton stepped into the room, his face grim. Daniel hesitated, then slid the folder toward him. Colton read in silence, his eyes narrowing as he moved down the list. When he reached the final name, Martin's, he exhaled slowly and closed the folder. "You've done what I should have done years ago," Colton said. "But if you take this public, the town will fracture. Some of these men still have families who will fight to protect their legacy. It won't be easy, and it won't be safe." Daniel met his gaze, his voice steady. "My father faced them alone. I won't, not anymore." Outside, thunder rolled across the hills, as though the very earth was preparing for the reckoning that had been delayed too long. The silence of 1979 was breaking, and there was no stopping the storm that followed. The town gathered in the courthouse 2 weeks later, the pews filled with faces both anxious and defiant. Word of Daniel's findings had spread quickly, and the weight of 20 years of silence pressed down on the room. Sheriff Colton stood at the front, the folder of evidence resting on the table before him. Reporters lined the back wall, their cameras clicking softly, capturing a story the town had long buried. Daniel sat near the front, the worn Bible his father had carried resting in his lap. He felt the eyes of the congregation on him, some filled with sympathy, others sharp with resentment. Among them were the families of the men named in the list, their expressions tight, their whispers sharp as knives. The reckoning had begun, and it was not welcomed by all. Colton read aloud portions of the tape, his voice solemn as Thomas Reed's words filled the room. The pastor's warning about corruption and betrayal echoed through the chamber like a sermon given decades too late. Gasps rippled through the crowd, some people weeping quietly, others turning away as if unwilling to hear. The charred ledgers and the blood-stained cloth were presented, grim tokens of what had been hidden. And then came the list of names. When Deacon Martins was spoken, the silence deepened. His absence from the room was louder than any denial. Colton explained the confession Daniel had recorded at the farmhouse, a testimony that confirmed what had been whispered but never spoken. For the first time in 20 years, the truth was laid bare, unvarnished and undeniable. Afterward, Daniel stepped forward, his voice unsteady but clear. My father believed truth mattered more than fear. He stood here, in this town, and he chose to face men who betrayed both their vows and their faith. He paid with his life, but his voice is still with us. We can't undo what was done, but we can refuse to let silence win again. The room was still, the storm outside rattling the windows as though echoing his words. For the first time since 1979, Daniel felt the shadow of his father's disappearance lift, replaced by a fragile but unyielding light. Justice had come slowly, scarred and incomplete, but it had come. And as Daniel closed the Bible in his hands, he knew his father's final sermon had finally been heard.